Everyone, welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 21st. And as you know, Monday was President's Day, and we are a little bit behind because of a snow day, but I do intend on catching up. So I encourage you to keep up with the readings. And where we are now is transitioning out of film and starting to talk about short story. And I left you the last time that we had a video with talking about, or at least thinking about, a sorrowful woman. And one of the things that I suggested in terms of reading a piece of literature is that you want to read it 3 times, ideally. The first time for plot, so that you know what's happening. The second time for analysis. And then the third time, ultimately, to refresh your memory before you're going to discuss the piece or write about the piece. And you'll see in the notes below under the section on a sorrowful woman that I suggested that you start with the author, Gail Godwin, who is a female author. We're given a bit of a biography on her in the textbook. And this turns out it will be important when we read the story and we find out what some of the themes are. The piece was published in 1971, and we're not told about a specific time period, so we can assume that it's set in the time in which it was published, 1971. And the 70s were a pretty tumultuous time, but particularly in reference to our understanding this story, it was the women's rights movement. And I think that when we read A Sorrowful Woman, we'll see it's very much written in the context of what happens to female when female is dissatisfied with the stereotypical roles of wife and mother. In fact, we're even told in the opening line, and this is what I gave you to try to contemplate in your last attendance question, once upon a time there was a wife and mother, one too many times. And the once upon a time sets the idea of a fairy tale. And we expect fairy tales to begin with once upon a time. But this is a fairy tale that does not have a happy ending, even though we are told in fairy tales they lived happily ever after. This is a story of reality with what happens with the happily ever after. And the title indicates that our main character is sorrowful. Of course, our question, or one of our main questions, happens to be, why is this character sorrowful? Notice that the use of the word a or the article of the a rather than the, suggests a sorrowful woman, one of many, rather than a particular woman. And notice how none of the characters are given names in the story, and this will be important. It helps to generalize and universalize the characters so readers can plug themselves into the characters. And it also reduces the characters to their roles. It takes away all of their sense of individuality outside of their role of wife or mother or husband or child. I always thought that an interesting story to read would be something like A Sorrowful Man or A Sorrowful Child. But that isn't the story that Gail Godwin wants us to give us. She wants us to read this piece from the perspective of the female. And note the setting, that it happens one winter evening, already establishing something that's negative. Winter is oftentimes associated with descent and death. The seasons are oftentimes used to signify times of life, with spring representing birth, and then summer representing the height of life, fall beginning to represent descent, and then finally we end with winter, and that is descent or death. And evening is very similar in that morning can represent the beginning of life, and then afternoon can represent the height of life. Evening can represent the beginning of descent, and nighttime can represent descent. So we're told throughout the piece that the husband understands her, and of course our question is, does he really? And he certainly can't be faulted for in any way mistreating his wife, but he's enabling her behavior. That's a psychology term that we would use today, but probably wouldn't be as well known in the late 60s or early 70s. We can't necessarily fault any of these characters for not being able to identify some of what they're experiencing. And what she needs, obviously, is is something that he can't provide. In fact, she can't even articulate herself what she needs. And while we can speculate as to why she's sorrowful, the one too many times of wife and mother suggests that this is a role that just is not fulfilling to this particular woman. Even though, by all outside accounts, she has a very comfortable life with a good husband who tries to support her, a healthy child who is a tender golden age of 3. Unless you've ever had a 3-year-old, and you'll know that sometimes they're not tender nor golden. And they obviously are financially comfortable. They send their laundry out, if you notice that little detail. They go out to dinners, if you notice that detail. They hire in a nanny for help, if you notice that detail. And this would be the ideal world for someone like Faye and Kai in A Secret Sorrow, that formulaic piece of fiction. But this is a piece of fiction that is literature, that which scholars and critics could think worthy of study, if nothing else because it has depth and complexity and originality. Notice the use of color imagery, and this is something that you might have missed the first time you were reading the story. The child's eyes and the husband's shirt are both gray. Gray is oftentimes associated with the negative, with darkness, with despair. Gray is also an in-between color. It's not quite black or white. There's a certain level of ambivalence to it. As we see with these characters, these aren't good characters or bad characters. These are complex characters. The episode with her bra, I think, is quite telling, because if this were a piece of formulaic fiction, as the husband is helping to undress her and the bra is removed and hanging, one would think that we would get an erotic episode, but that's not at all what we're going to get. And in fact, I would argue that the bra works as a symbol. Bras are oftentimes viewed as restrictive, and of course the roles of wife and mother, at least for this woman, and perhaps for other women during her time period, are also restrictive. Keep in mind that some of the obvious possibilities of 2024, such as divorce or schooling or career change, would be less obvious during this time period. In fact, we're not even told that this woman has a job. She spends almost all of her time at home. In fact, in the 1800s, the home was referenced as a kind of prison for female. And of course, bras also offer support. And one could say that this is what this woman is looking for, support, but her family just doesn't know how to provide it. We certainly can't fault the child. He's quite young, but the husband, of course, is a bit different. We get a lot of foreshadowing, hints about how the story will end. Thing is, we don't know how the story will end until ultimately the story ends, which means we have to reread. She wants instant sleep. Little bit of foreshadowing for what occurs towards the ending of the story, which is her suicide. And that might be a detail you might have missed, because it never directly states that she committed suicide. It says that she went to the cupboard and took what was hers. And if we're reading carefully, we know that in the cupboard where that was the sleeping draft, that at this point the husband is making in large batches. So she basically consumes all of that and overdoses. And when the husband rolls back her eyes and checks her heartbeat and her wrist, basically he's looking for vitals. The child is completely unaware and asks, can we have the turkey for supper tonight? But the child is aware enough to say that mommy is tired from doing all of our things again, something that the husband never seems to be able to conceptualize. So if you've ever heard the cliche expression, out of the mouths of babes. And of course, before that suicide, she engages in a flurry of activity and domestic chores, illustrating that, yes, she is capable of fulfilling these roles, but these roles literally kill her. So if you've ever heard somebody say, figuratively, this job is killing me, that's exactly what it's doing to this particular character in a time period that offered few other options. And one would suspect that it was pieces like this and other pieces of art at the time period that helped to bring about some of the changes that we are witnessing today. We see some episodes where she's playing with the child, and the child for instance, acts out as a vicious tiger. Think about some of the associations with tiger. Tigers are predatory, they're dangerous. This is how she sees her child. And the child scratches her wrist, and they both watch a little bead of blood from form on the scratch. And of course, slashing one's wrist is a somewhat common method for suicide. Some more foreshadowing here. The woman is so frightened off by a grasshopper, by a live being at this point, that she ultimately needs to isolate herself completely from her family. You know, prior to this, she's hit her child. And she does it when the husband can see. It's a cry for help. And the husband responds by getting her domestic help, but that's not the help that she needs. The perfect girl who's young, dynamic, and not pretty. Not pretty so that the girl is not a sexual threat. Again, this is not going to be one of these cliche stories where the father has an affair with the babysitter. And the thing is that the girl is a threat because the girl happily is able to fulfill all of the roles that one expects of wife and mother, whether it's because the girl is suited for it or whether it's because the girl is compensated for it and the girl has the freedom to decide to take on that role and leave that role. And that's something that, of course, the wife and mother does not have. The girl inhabits a white room. Think about, again, color symbolism. White has lots of positive associations. It is considered pure, new start. But it also has negative associations as well. Something that's considered to be somewhat dull and can easily be dirtied. Something institutional. And when we see the story move into the winter afternoon, again, being versed in some of the symbolism of seasons and setting and times, one thinks that as we're moving earlier on into the day, that this might mean that there's some sort of epiphany for the woman or something positive for the woman. It may not necessarily be positive for the family. It may not be positive for the husband or the child, but it might be positive for her. Especially as the woman decides to move into the girl's room, in fact, stating that she wants to take on the persona of the girl, a time when the woman didn't have the responsibilities of being a wife or a mother. And notice that both are referenced in that opening line, a wife and mother. And the woman is spending a lot of time engaged in activities that are associated with self-care. She's brushing her hair a great deal. And if you know your fairy tales, you know how important hair is for something like Rapunzel. Definitely this story touches on the idea of fairy tale. In fact, there's even reference to her being like a virgin in the tower. She is also, hairbrushing is a kind of repetitive motion that can be self-soothing in some instances. She's writing a sonnet. And while we haven't talked about poetry yet, you might be familiar what a sonnet is. A sonnet is one of the strictest forms of poetry that exists. We usually talk about a sonnet in relation to a Shakespearean sonnet, where it has very strict rules with length and with rhyme and with meter and even with subject matter. And the woman is thinking about writing a sonnet. In other words, she's thinking about following the rules. And then she realizes that her sonnet can be any number of lines long. It doesn't even have to rhyme. So as she's contemplating that maybe her sonnet could be A-B-B-A, that's not ABBA, the 70s musical group. That's the way that we determine the rhyme scheme or the rhyme pattern in a poem, which we will talk about as the semester progresses, that basically you look at the last word of each line and you identify each new rhyme with the letter of the alphabet, starting with an A being the first rhyme, and then when you have a new rhyme, you go to the letter B and so forth and so on, and then you try to determine if there's some sort of a pattern. So A, B, B, A, it would be the first line and the fourth line would rhyme together. The two middle lines would rhyme together. but she realizes that she doesn't have to do that. It doesn't even have to rhyme. So all of these things, as she's spending her time reading, and reading, it was considered to be a very subversive activity, especially in the 1800s. I teach a class in women in literature from the 1800s, because reading can give you all kinds of dangerous ideas. It's one of the reasons why today we have questions about censorship and book banning, just because of the way that reading can encourage someone to think outside of societal norms. And if one wants to maintain those societal norms, then one would probably want to discourage any reading that would question those societal norms. Of course, we know that at this point, the woman is so isolated that she's taking notes underneath the door. It might seem completely unrealistic until we start talking about someone like Emily Dickinson, which we will in the poetry section, who is known for rather eccentric behavior, spending most of her time in her bedroom, and having much of her correspondence through letters. And even today in 2024, think about the idea of two individuals inhabiting the same space, maybe the same room, maybe even the same sofa, and texting to one another. So as much as things change, perhaps they remain the same. And these notes feel suffocating to her because these notes come with expectations from the husband slash father and the son. That ultimately she's going to go back to her former role as wife and mother, which is how the story begins. Notice how the husband and child are unoccupied while the wife is engaged in household duties. And she's so overwhelmed, she asks the husband, will you read a story to the child to put him to sleep? Bedtime story. One assumes that this is not normal behavior for the husband, that it's usually the wife who takes on this role. And in fact, the story she asks the husband to read is quite telling about the monkey who ate too many bananas. And of course, there's a wife and mother one too many times. What happens when you have too much of something? And these joyful notes that feel suffocating to her, as well as her realization when she does sneak out of her room every so often and realize that things are changed and that the family is continuing on without her. It's just too much for her. So on page 42, or at least at the edition that I had ordered for us, on page 42, quote, she went to the cupboard and took what was hers, unquote. And of course, earlier on we're told that she's storing the batches of the sleeping draft in the cupboard. So this is the hint of her ultimately going to commit suicide. And she completes all of those chores and fulfills her expectations, while the child says on page 43, as I had indicated earlier, she's tired from doing all her things again. That's probably the best explanation I can give as to the woman's sorrow. And yes, it's true that obviously the woman is depressed, but that answer is a little bit too simplistic. It's not that she's depressed. The question is, why is she depressed? And it's because of the societal expectations of being wife and mother, one too many times. The ending questions at the ending of the story can help you as well. Sometimes students like to read those questions before they even begin reading a piece to give them a sense of what could be important. Some students prefer not to have any spoilers and don't want to read any questions after or beforehand, and prefer to read the questions afterwards. But you can see that many of those questions are in the context of comparing and contrasting A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman, since both of these short stories are paired together. One being a piece of formulaic fiction that's trite and cliche and predictable, and written primarily for entertainment and profit. Not that there's anything wrong with entertainment and profit, but ultimately it probably doesn't have the depth or the sophistication of a piece of literature, something that's part of the canon, or that could be part of the canon, that which scholars and critics think could be worthy of analytic analysis and study. And if nothing else, I think you can see that A Sorrowful Woman requires much more attention and much more interpretation than A Secret Sorrow. And that perhaps is the best way to illustrate the difference between formulaic writing and more complex pieces of writing, is by not just telling you what the differences are, but showing what the differences are. The editor of this textbook chose these two stories, but they didn't necessarily have to be These two short stories, the editor chose A Secret Sorrow from a Harlequin romance, but it could have been any genre literature. It could have been horror, sci-fi, and I myself admit that I enjoy reading genre literature, and that some genre literature, and horror is my favorite, actually does have depth and complexity to it. If you've ever read Frankenstein or Dracula or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and these are some of the texts that I actually examine in my Gothic literature class. And the same can be said for movies. Some are just meant for entertainment and profit, and that's fine. But some have depth and complexity. And I think that we saw it with Citizen Kane and with Roger Ebert's analysis of Citizen Kane, that one could go through that movie scene by scene, shot by shot, and analyze it. Just like one could go through a short story like A Sorrowful Woman and go through it paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence, perhaps even word by word. Now, obviously, we don't have the kind of time to do that with all of the pieces that we will be reading and viewing this semester. But you will have the opportunity to do something that's a little bit more in depth when it comes to doing some writing assignments, which we will talk about in greater depth starting next class. I wanted to at least have us have some background with Citizen Kane, and also have a little bit of background in some fiction before we started to get into the idea of writing an academic paper about either Citizen Kane or one of the short stories that we are devoting our attention to. And in fact, what I had assigned as the second short story is on page 15 through 16. But luckily, I've been able to find links for these short stories online for free. So I've also provided the link for A Sorrowful Woman, as well as provided the link for A Story of an Hour. And The Story of an Hour was embedded in an earlier set of readings that talked a little bit about how to read literature. But I wanted us to reread the story from an analytic perspective. And reading it from the beginning, which means, again, looking at the date, 1894. And if the 1970s were a time of restriction for female, they were even more restrictive in the late 1800s. Women did not have the right to vote or to own property. They were basically seen as possessions, first of their fathers and then ultimately of their husbands. So it was a very different world. Once again, we have a female author, Kate Chopin, which is perhaps, again, even more surprising that we've got a female author who's writing and was able to get published. And we are told in a very short piece, a page and a half or so, about a life-changing hour. As you know, even a second in someone's life can be life-changing. In this instance, it's an hour, where we're introduced to Mrs. Mallard, who is told that her husband has died in a train accident. And her initial response is not necessarily of great sorrow, but of relief and hope of possibility. Thinking about the time period helps us to understand her particular reaction. And that an interesting factoid is in the 1800s, it was much less likely for a woman to remarry after widowhood than it would be for a man to remarry after widowhood. There are probably lots of social and psychological reasons for that, but I suspect that some of them are economic as well. That if a woman became a widow and there weren't any direct heirs, such as children, and notice that in The Story of an Hour, there are no reference to children. There are no references to children in the way there was with A Sorrowful Woman. Then the woman could inherit the estate. She would have a certain level of economic power and also a certain level of social respect. Divorce was not a possibility during this time period. It certainly was in the 1970s, but it came with social stigma. So this life-changing hour with Mrs. Mallard, note we're not given her first name initially. We are given her husband's first name, Brentley Mallard, which gives him a sense of individuality and autonomy in a way that she doesn't have. In fact, Mrs. is also quite telling because it denotes marital station. The term Mr. does not indicate marital station, but Miss and Mrs. is a distinction that would show a female's marital status. In fact, that was the reason why Ms. was created. And Mrs. Mallard, of course, the surname oftentimes changing upon marriage, and the loss of identity again, so that basically Mrs. Mallard is part of Brentley Mallard at this point. And the surname Mallard, lots of bird imagery here. If you know anything about Kate Chopin, and I've read others of her works, she uses lots of bird imagery, oftentimes a bird as a symbol for female, something that's small and delicate that oftentimes is entrapped in cage, but can be released so that it can fly if its wings aren't broken or hurt. Again, we could think of a lot of parallels for female and some of the restrictions for female during this time period. Eventually, we are told Mrs. Mallard's first name, which is Louise, only later in the story where she believes that she is now a widow. And notice that we are given her sister's first name, Josephine. One assumes that perhaps Josephine is single. And notice the connection between the first names of Louise and Josephine. They both start with male roots, Louis and Joseph. Again, sort of reinforcing the idea of the prominence and importance given to male. If we were to do also a little bit of research about mallards, which I've done with previous classes, you'd find out that these are common ducks. One might say that this could be a common situation that Mrs. Mallard is experiencing, a sense of entrapment and repression, oppression, even in marriage. And also, we learn that mallards, the males are quite colorful, but the females are rather drab. Perhaps parallels with the societal viewpoint of male and female, that attention is given to the male, not necessarily to the female. They mate for life. However, the male is oftentimes, let's say, wayward. And again, we could perhaps draw some contemporary parallels, or at least parallels with human society in the time period of this story. We're told at the very beginning that Mrs. Mallard, Louise, has heart trouble. And this is a little bit of foreshadowing for how the story ends, because we find out at the ending of the story that it was all a terrible mistake. And the husband didn't die in a train accident. So she ultimately is so overcome that she dies of joy that kills. And of course, those surrounding her assume that she dies of happiness because her husband has returned. We, however, know what the other characters don't know, because we spent time with Mrs. Mallard alone, which was also considered a dangerous activity for a female in the 1800s, to spend too much time by herself. She could get herself into trouble. And we know that while Mrs. Mallard did feel a certain level of grief, after all, she had loved Brentley Mallard sometimes, which goes to show how complex the feeling of love can be. And she talks about Brentley Mallard's kind hands that never, and his face that never looks save with love upon her. So this is a supportive husband. It's less about Brentley Mallard as an individual, and it's more about the institution of marriage as a whole, especially what marriage can mean for female. But when we're told heart trouble, that's very different than the term heart disease that we're given at the ending of the story. And that also is significant, because heart trouble suggests a troubled heart, and not necessarily a heart with physical heart disease, high cholesterol, let's say, but emotional despair or unhappiness, which is what we find with Mrs. Mallard. She didn't even know necessarily that she felt trapped or unhappy until the possibility of freedom was open to her. She didn't even dare consider the possibility of being free. And this piece uses many symbols of freedom, things like an open window. Windows basically open up to the outside world, and the fact that they're open, or at least this window happens to be open, illustrates the idea of expansiveness and freedom. She sits in a roomy armchair. So notice it's not a stool. Notice it's not a sofa. An armchair is made for one person. Now she can revel in the idea of her singlehood. It's roomy. She doesn't have to share it with anybody. The armchair, especially in the 1800s, was usually reserved for the male. So all of these images kind of reinforce the idea of Mrs. Mallard experiencing a sense of freedom. Something that we saw a sorrowful woman struggling with, but almost 100 years later. And it's almost certain that the author of A Sorrowful Woman, Gail Godwin, who had a PhD in English and basically won quite a few awards for her writing, was well aware of the short story, The Story of an Hour, that had been written in the 1800s. And this story probably helped inspire her retelling of the tale from a 1970s perspective with A Sorrowful Woman. So the more pieces of literature that you've read, well, then the more you can see the connections between previous pieces and more contemporary pieces. Almost like with music, you can appreciate a song for itself, but if you know the songs that helped inspire it previously, well, then you have a much richer sense of the understanding of the music. Additional symbols of freedom, the open square, again, the sense of expansiveness. It's springtime, which represents renewal, rebirth. There's sparrows, notice all that bird imagery again. There's rain. Now, rain can oftentimes be seen as a negative, but it can also be seen as a positive because rain can cleanse, water can cleanse. And of course, water leads to growth. And we're even told that the rain is basically dissipating and that blue skies are coming forth. We're given a direction. And in a story this short, probably every detail has some significance. We're told about clouds in the west. Not the east, not the south, not the north, but the west. So if we're given the west as a direction, then we should probably think about how the west might be important in this story. I can't help but think about the rising and the setting of the sun, that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. This is the setting or the ending of an old life for Mrs. Mallard and perhaps the beginning of a new life. It could be foreshadowing that it's going to be the ending of her life, hence the setting sun. I also think about westward expansion, about the idea of breaking out into new horizons. And we're told that she was young, but yet her face was repressed. And she feels something creeping towards her. Creeping has a lot of negative associations, a lot of negative denotations associated with, or negative connotations associated with it. A denotation is the dictionary definition of the word. The connotation is the associations of the word. And she doesn't necessarily want this. She's trying to beat it back. But eventually she comes to the point where she says, free, 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 free body and soul free. So it's not really a stretch to say that she feels free. Of course, you would need to defend that if you were writing about it, and this would be a wonderful quote to cite that she literally says out loud, free, 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 free body and soul, free. And that now she would live for herself. And perhaps my favorite quote, there would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. And the reason why I like this quote so much is because thus far we've just been talking about female, and this quote broadens it to the institution of marriage, that there will be no powerful will in which men and women believe they have a right to impose a powerful will upon a fellow creature. So this is less about females' role in marriage and more about the institution of marriage on both partners. And notice how it's assumed in this instance that a marriage is between a man and a woman, that it's a heterosexual union, which I think is quite telling and definitely indicative of the time period. And then she's thinking about spring days and summer days. Again, these are times of the season that are associated with positives. But then she dies of heart disease when she sees Brentley Mallard again, a joy that kills, which is quite ironic because, yes, she might have felt some relief, but she probably also felt a good amount of disappointment and sadness. And the questions at the end, one of the reasons why I wanted to give you this story is because it asks you to consider how your reading might change, let's say, if you were younger or older, if you were newlywed or if you were recently divorced. How might your socioeconomic status or your religious views influence your reading? So this goes to show that readings can change based on demographics. Readings can change based on life experience. And all of these readings can be valid as long as there's evidence in the text to support it. Basically, what you're doing is being an attorney, and you are gathering all the pieces of evidence that exist to present to the judge, who's the reader. And a good attorney can argue either side of the case, guilty or innocent. Of course, one side might have more pieces of evidence than another, but a good attorney knows how to formulate all those pieces of evidence so that their position is possible. And that's basically what your job is to do. And then the reader, let's say a teacher like myself, is supposed to remain neutral like a judge. Doesn't matter what the personal opinion is that ultimately the judge needs to be swayed by the arguments that are presented to the judge. It's one of the reasons why English majors are so popular for people contemplating law school. So basically, the idea of how, let's say, one's marital status might influence one's reading. I've always wanted to teach this story to do two different classes. One, a group of newlyweds, and one to a group of newly divorced individuals. And I've never done it, but my suspicion is I'd have two very different kinds of class conversations, both equally valid, just based on the details that the individuals decided to pick up on, and how some readers feel that Mrs. Mallard is monstrous for reveling in her husband's death. Others feel that she's sympathetic because she's trapped in a patriarchal system. And could it be possible to hold a bit of both? And it's a little bit more complicated with the Sorrowful Woman because a child is involved. So we might say that we can certainly understand a sorrowful woman feeling trapped, but she also has responsibilities, if to nothing else, responsibilities to her child. This is an additional layer that we don't get in the story of An Hour. But note how similar both of these pieces are, at least in terms of the thematics. So I wanted to move on to a third story. This one is very, very different. It's called A Rose for Emily. It's on page 77, and I've also included a link. And the story was published in 1931 by the author William Faulkner, who has quite a interesting biography, born and raised in the South, and was quite ashamed of how some of his ancestors were involved in the institution of slavery, and that often is a subject matter for his writing. And in reading this story, and I hope you've read the story by this point, but if not, you are going to get a small reprieve because I'm not going to talk very much about it because I'm cognizant of the time. Again, we're approximately a class behind or so because of the snow day, but I do hope to start catching up. The story is somewhat confusing and deliberately so. And one of the things about the story that makes it confusing is its mixed chronology, that we don't get things in chronological order. So that's a little bit of a hint. If you put things in chronological order, the story makes a lot of sense. In fact, it's even predictable in some respects. And one of the things I wanted to assign in addition to this story was an author interview that occurred in 1959, years after the story was published. Unfortunately, I was not able to find a free link for the author interview, but the author talks a little bit about the significance of things like the title or the theme or the symbolism, at least from his perspective. And I wanted us to, next class, talk a little bit about that and see whether we agree or disagree. And yes, I will dare to disagree with some of the author's perspectives, even though he wrote the story. So, but as long as there's evidence in the text to support it. And this story is written in a particular kind of writing that's known as Southern Gothic. I had mentioned Gothic earlier. I teach a class in Gothic literature. Basically, this was a style of writing that came to popularity in 1800s England with pieces like Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Dracula. It started actually with a piece called The Castle of Otranto, which you probably haven't heard of, and it's not a particularly well-written piece, but it helped to establish some of the conventions of Gothic. Death and decay and darkness. Setting is very important. Think about something like Halloween. There's oftentimes a mystery that has to be explored. There could be possible supernatural elements. And good Gothic literature is literature that is symbolic, so it is also representational, much like what we've been talking about all semester long with good pieces of film and good pieces of literature. So you can expect the literal story, but also the figurative or the metaphorical or the symbolic. And in terms of thinking about Southern Gothic, the Gothic tradition, which began in England, moved over to the United States when individuals from England moved to the United States and settled and started a New England, in effect. So that's where our name comes from. You might be familiar with some of these authors, Edgar Allan Poe, for instance. And then there were a group of authors from the American South, and they were using the Gothic tradition, but they were setting their stories in the American South, and that's known as Southern Gothic. And that's basically what William Faulkner is doing. And the South lends itself very nicely, I think, to some of the themes of the Gothic because of its very painful history of slavery. And William Faulkner's story addresses the idea of this fallen system of aristocracy that is illustrated by a Miss Emily, who is no longer able to benefit from slavery. And we see how she lives in a dead past. So that's a little bit of a preview of what's going to be happening with A Rose for Emily. So I will very quickly tell you the plot of A Rose for Emily in chronological order. And then what I will do is ask you to, without too much guidance from me, select a quote from A Rose for Emily. That will be the attendance question for our discussion forum, which will be due Friday the 25th. Of course, if you need additional time, please let me know. To identify an important quote in A Rose for Emily and indicate why you think it's important. So in terms of the story, if I were to put it in chronological order, Miss Emily is basically from a aristocratic family, and she is a Grierson. Her father is quite controlling, and he doesn't allow her to date. And it turns out that eventually he dies. She has great difficulty accepting his death, holds on to his body, his corpse, for 3 days actually, until the town convinces her to relinquish it. And then she self-isolates for a while and then reemerges with a new haircut and basically a new outlook on life and begins dating now that she can't be stopped by her father. And ultimately she begins dating Homer Barron. And this is quite the talk of the town because he's the exact opposite of what anybody would expect from Miss Emily. He is a northerner. Remember, she's a southerner. He's a laborer. Remember, she's an aristocrat. And as they continue to date, there's all kinds of speculation about what's going to happen between Miss Emily and Homer. It turns out that eventually Emily goes to the drugstore and buys some arsenic. She's supposed to tell the druggist why she's buying arsenic. She refuses to do so. The druggist sells it to her anyway. This goes to show the kind of power that Miss Emily has and the way she can intimidate people. And what they end up doing is writing on the arsenic that it's for rats. And then she is basically, or I should say Homer is basically seen entering her home and never again is seen. And he disappears, and the town doesn't really question that too much. The town had speculated that perhaps Emily was going to buy the arsenic to kill herself, so they were waiting to see what would happen. And then Emily self-isolates again. There is a strange smell coming from the home. No one dares to confront her. How could you confront a woman that there's a smell coming out of her house? So they just spread lime around. The new generation comes forth, and the new generation wants some taxes. Miss Emily, with the old generation, had an agreement that she didn't need to pay taxes. The problem with Miss Emily is while she came from an aristocratic family, they no longer had money, which meant that Miss Emily didn't have money because they weren't profiting off of the institution of slavery. The town, rather than confront Miss Emily about the fact that she couldn't afford her taxes, had created this elaborate lie. And you have to untangle some of the language because it's written and very much in the 1800 sense of language. But nevertheless, or the early 1900 sense of language, I should say. But the townspeople, they create this convoluted tale that Emily's father had owed the town money, so this is the way the town was paying it back. But that was all a lie to allow Miss Emily to keep her dignity and not have to pay her taxes. And now that years have gone by and there's a new generation in political power, they want their taxes. She refuses to pay and says that they should talk to Colonel Sartoris, who is from the older generation. He had made that agreement with Miss Emily. Problem is, Colonel Sartoris had been dead for quite a few years. Eventually, oh, and I left out one piece. There's insanity that runs in Miss Emily's family as well. And then eventually Miss Emily passes away. And of course, there's all kinds of speculation about Miss Emily because she has isolated herself for so many years. So the entire town goes to her funeral, and they're very eager at the ending of the funeral to go see her home. And they find a room that's locked away, and they break down the door. And what do they find in the room? And you've probably figured it out. Homer's corpse. Emily killed Homer so that she could keep him forever. It seems that he was probably likely going to leave her. We're even told, that he liked men. And it's less about his sexual orientation, I think, and more about the fact that he really wasn't going to commit to Miss Emily. He was just a laborer in town that was having his fun, and then he would leave and move on. And the first ending you might have missed because of the mischronology, but if you were able to anticipate it because you've been trained by English teachers to look for every little detail, perhaps you could be surprised by the second ending, which is on the bed lay a strand of iron gray hair. And Miss Emily's hair didn't turn gray until years after Homer disappeared. So that means that Miss Emily was laying next to the corpse years after the corpse had decomposed. And whatever your imagination is doing right now about what would have occurred with Miss Emily and Homer's corpse is much worse than anything any author could have provided. So rather than giving us the gory details, just letting our imaginations do the work for us. So that is the plot of A Rose for Emily. And if you missed some of those pieces, and it would be very easy to do so, you know the rule: reread, reread, reread. And we'll talk about some of the interpretations of the piece next class, but I'm curious to see which quote you might select from A Rose for Emily that you think is important and indicate why you think it's important. And of course, next class we'll talk about Rose for Emily. We have more stories coming up, and you can see that I've included that in the notes below. Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal. And also, I wanted to talk about writing papers. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.